Hi, I'm
Me to stand.
Heather Root. I'm a professor here at Weber State, and I will be moderating this session. Session is called Selling Clean Air, Understanding Message Appeals and Sources. And we will hear from Alexi Lamb, who's right here. She became Utah State University's first sustainability coordinator in 2012, where she works with faculty, staff, and students to integrate sustainability into campus operations and academic programs. And we're going to learn what works in clean air advertising from Alexi today. She will be speaking for about 30 to 40 minutes. There will be about 10 minutes at the end for questions, so please hold your questions until then. Her presentation will be available on the Summit website after the conference is over. And I think with that, I'll turn it over to Alexi Lamb.
Great. Hi, thank you for coming today. I'm the sustainability coordinator at Utah State, and I also work with a community clean air volunteer group in northern Utah with Edwin Stafford, who is a professor in marketing at Utah State. And together, we've been trying to construct a roadmap for developing compelling clean air advocacy messages by identifying the appeals people are using, the people who are behind them, who are the sponsors, who are they trying to appeal to, with the idea that we can make more effective clean air advertising by going through all of these. Today, I'm going to go through the sources of the message, the appeals that were used, and who the recipients are, with the goal of assisting existing efforts and researching to increase our ability to do consistently effective clean air messaging. And I'm going to want to hear from you, because I know a lot of people in here are doing different types of PSAs and outreach, and I'm sure a lot of you have learned good things too. All right, so advocacy, advertising, outreach, public service announcements, which I'm going to call PSAs, serve three objectives: raising awareness of public issues, increasing and encouraging concern, and changing people's behavior. PSAs can raise awareness of issues, and research has shown that they can do that, but they often have limited effectiveness at actually changing behavior. Even effective campaigns maybe change behavior 5 to 10%. So the challenge is that we're trying to direct pro-social behavior, like not idling, things that will improve air quality, but we're trying to do it sometimes with posters on a wall. And people need to think about that message much later when they're actually in their cars driving or picking up their kids at a school. So you're trying to influence people's behavior in the future and get them to reference the message you gave them at a later time. And that's hard. So we need our messages to be vivid, we need them to be emotionally and personally relevant to people, and we need them to be memorable, something that people are going to remember. So an example of this would be the splattered egg sizzling on a skillet for drug campaigns, like "This is your brain on drugs," where people remember the campaign. And we know that these have happened. There have been some really successful behavior change, different PSAs that have been out there in the past. So we can start with anti-littering with the gruff, "Don't mess with Texas," which was targeting males ages 16 to 24 who had been identified as the primary culprits of littering in the state of Texas. The "Don't Mess with Texas" campaign was trying to appeal to state pride, which is a big thing in Texas, and bumper stickers started popping up on the back of trucks all over the country, started going up on signs on the side of the road, and in the first year, it reduced roadside trash by 29%. From 1985 to 1990, litter was reduced by more than 72%. So some of these campaigns can be amazingly successful, especially like in the case of littering, where there is a specific action you can give people. Another good example is Smokey Bears, Only You Can Prevent Forest Fires, which started in 1944 and is back with Bring It In for a hashtag Smokey Bear Hug. And again, really successful. It went from, at the beginning of the campaign, about 22 million acres per year were burned in fires. 9 out of 10 forest fires are caused by humans. And that was reduced to 8 million acres. To give some scope of scale on that, 22 million acres is like burning up the state of Indiana. So big impact just by doing an advertising campaign. And in this particular case, it was advertised to children who then influenced their parents to think about this when they're out and about. And simultaneously, between the beginning of this campaign and the present, we have 10 times more people going through national forest. So more people are there, and we have fewer fires happening. Moving on, another successful one is the crash test dummies. You could learn a lot from a dummy. Buckle your safety belt. Again, targeting children who can influence their parents. And it was associated with an increase from 21% of people wearing safety belts in 1985 to 79% of Americans who are buckling up today. So ideally, target audiences can be reached by some of these messages, and hopefully we can tailor them so they'll reach people. And they'll change their behaviors and act accordingly when the actual moment to make a decision comes up. Interestingly, air pollution, which is the topic of today's conversation, has not been the target of one of these messages yet. This may be because air pollution is often a regional and episodic problem here in Utah. Because up in northern Utah in Logan, where Utah State is, we have a bowl-like topography that's prone in the winter to inversions. So lack of wind and an upper layer of air traps air at the bottom, cold air, and also pollutants that are coming from our businesses, our buildings, agriculture, factories, our cars. And that can get embedded in people's lungs. It goes into their bloodstream, and it causes a lot of health problems that can last long after the inversion dissipates. But the thing is that it's only visible for a few days a year, so we don't necessarily think about it all the time. And it's also often caused by things that we don't necessarily feel like we can control, like driving cars and heating our homes, where we're burning things like natural gas, gasoline, propane, and different things, and that can lead to people becoming apathetic about it because they don't feel like they can control it, or some people even become antagonistic towards the cause, which is a challenge. And there are no silver bullets to solve our air pollution problem. So what our goal is with all of the research we've done, and we're about to get into it, is to help people, empower people to preserve clean air through making personal decisions like taking public transit, carpooling, and not idling their cars. So we asked, what does it take to create something that can be as influential as Smokey Bear or as crash dummies? How can we do that? And what we did is we ended up going through Google Images, among other things, to identify what kind of messaging is out there. So we found over 100 clean air PSAs. We identified ones that were in US and Canada. We sorted the message basis on their appeals and sources and ruled out campaigns that were advocating for clean air on the behalf of clean coal, for example, or nuclear facilities. And then tried to just focus on clean air awareness and education. The PSAs were organized into one or more appeal types, and some of them actually combined appeal types, and we'll see a few of those. And additionally, several ads had one or more sponsors, and some of them had none at all. And we're not sure if that was because some of them were out of websites. They weren't necessarily posters, and maybe being embedded in a website, they didn't feel like they needed a logo, or maybe it's on purpose, and we'll talk about why that might happen. First off, who's receiving the ads? Target audiences are really important because in order to receive a message or in order to be able to communicate a message to somebody, we have to know what people's values are and strategically frame it to match the beliefs and the values of our target audience. The stronger connection our message has to the target audience, the more effective we can be. So it's really important to understand it. We also need to think about who are the sources coming from. In order to understand that, we have to look at how we affect our intended audience's interpretation, and who the sponsor is can affect the perceived credibility of the message, the trustworthiness, and likability. If people perceive an organization as a good sponsor of a message, that's often because the organization is recognizable and likable. And consumers want to feel understood by that organization, and they also want to feel like that organization shares their personal values. So some PSA sponsors, such as government agencies, advocacy groups, or commercial sources, can be viewed with suspicion by a target audience if they don't feel like they're matching beliefs. And we want to understand what past research says about a sponsor's perceived persuasiveness. With the exception of youth, which was one type of sponsor, we're going to call it, or those that had none listed at all, most of the sponsors were organizations, which is predictable. And an organization makes a credible and persuasive message source when it's logically associated with the topic. So people would say maybe the American Lung Association is a credible and believable sponsor for clean air messaging. But it could maybe be that a gas company or oil company, something like that, would be a little bit more of a stretch for people. In some cases, though, we do find that people can increase their credibility by advocating to something that's slightly to their own disinterest or against their own self-interest. For example, if a prisoner is advocating for longer prison terms, they might be more credible than a judge advocating for the same thing. Additionally, organizations' values need to be similar, as we've discussed, and if target audiences want to have what we're going to call an associative reference group with them. So if it's the same religious denomination they are, it's an organization of which they want to be a part, then that's going to be a good sponsor for a message. Conversely, you can have a dissociative group. So if they perceive the sponsor to be the radical environmentalist, and that's not somebody they are, then the message can be discounted, not based on the message itself, but just on who said it. And finally, we have cases where there were no sponsors. And we know that these exist because we found them in our survey. We're not sure if it was intentional or not. And it's possible it would be intentional because research shows that if you, for example, are a dissociative reference group with a message, it can be beneficial to the organization to reveal themselves later after the people have received the message first, not knowing where it came from. So it is possible that some organizations would actually do that on purpose. All right. Government and nonprofit sources are perceived to be more credible than for-profit on the whole, according to research. For-profit organizations can enhance credibility by partnering with a nonprofit organization. And in nonprofit or partnered sponsorships, they're considered to be more effective by their target audience in producing intended behavior change. So those seem to be our ideal sponsorship situations. One of the questions that we had throughout the research, though, was that we do have statistics in recent political climate that show that government trust is waning in the United States, and especially among politically and socially conservative people. So a global annual trust and credibility survey, the Edelman Trust Barometer, also notes that government lags behind in credibility, trust, behind non-government organizations, businesses, and even the media. Which means that it's possible that there's an opportunity here to work outside of government organizations and potentially businesses, which their trust, according to surveys, far exceeds that of our own government. 80% of the public thinks that businesses could increase profits, improve economic and social conditions in the communities they operate. So maybe they're a good source for clean air advertising. So let's get into the actual sources. Where are these coming from? We identified 6 message source types and some messages that had no sponsor at all. We saw advocacy groups, which is a predictable one. This is one that you probably would have expected. It's groups like Mothers and Others for Clean Air, Sierra Club, American Lung Association, and we found ads similar to these. We also saw a lot of governments and health departments as a common source at the national, state, and local levels. And some of these were agencies within those. We saw the Bear River Health Department sponsorship of the Air Aware campaign. Canada, Department of Natural Resources provides ready-to-use anti-idling materials that people can bring off online. Typical sponsors for health information campaigns, though typically they have limited funding, right? So sometimes they're relying on donated advertising time, and donated advertising time comes behind paid advertising time. So sometimes government and organizations are also looking to partner with business and industry because that's where you can get some money. We saw some of these. It was maybe a less common source for clean air advertising. Some of these organizations, though, like business organizations, Salt Lake Chamber of Commerce had clean air champions. We also saw this where Chevron was partnering with the nonprofit UCare to trade old gas storage protective canisters. So there are a few of these where there's some partnerships going on, which we saw also in the research and the literature. Religious groups, there were a few. National Council of Churches PSA calling for clean air and climate justice. The Lutheran Advocacy Ministry of Pennsylvania's Clean Air for All God's Children campaign. And then we also see here one from the Mormon Environmental Stewardship Alliance, or MESA, as a possible. These were all just sources out there in our sample. Universities and colleges were common. So we see these all over the country, honestly. We see them here in Utah. We also see them at Stanford University. A lot of these are encouraging faculty, staff, and students to adopt clean air actions. And then children. The youth were a common source, and we were seeing these in school programs, but we were also seeing them in advocacy groups and religious groups as a potential source for advertising. And we know that, I mean, we covered a couple campaigns, right? Safety dummies, Smokey Bear, those seem to be effective, at least some of the time, when they're appealing to children who are then persuading their families. Parents want to be respected by their children, so when parents are requested to turn off their car, they want to be respected and therefore oblige, right? So it does work some of the time. And the next question, though, is how do children, for example, in this ad, how do they work as spokespeople? As appealing to children is one thing, but getting children to speak to the audience, what does that do? And they don't follow traditional roles of source credibility. They're not known for, nor do we expect them to have trustworthy or really reliable opinions. Children and the role of advocates, though, there is some study to show that this might work, especially when children are advocating for protective kind of actions. So when children are on a protective message as opposed to maybe a technical message, they can be more effective because it puts the adults in the role of protector, the people who are receiving the message, and they want to protect the children, so children can sometimes at least be good messengers. Okay, moving into the appeals. This is the kind of messaging that we were getting from these sources. An appeal is defined as how a sponsor encodes or they frame a message to activate the target audience's perceived needs and their desire to motivate or to take action. Research finds that audiences respond differently, for example, to humorous appeals versus anxiety-inducing fear messages. So the type of appeal does make a difference. And in this survey of things, we set out to identify the range of different message appeals that were being employed by clean air messaging and what the literature said about their potential effectiveness. All right, so we had 6 types of appeals. We're going to start with the call to action, which involves giving people instructions how they can actually implement an immediate response. And a lot of these were idle-free, like turn your key, be idle-free, it's your turn, turn it off. Turn the key, be idle-free. Such appeals are useful in situations where people need to be reminded. It might be an activity that they already wanted to do and they just forgot. So giving somebody a call to action, it gives them that moment, they remember to do that thing, and then turn off their car. They work often well for people who are already interested. But for people who are not, however, it can kind of border on telling people what to do. And evidence shows people don't really like to be told what to do, especially by the government, and especially in commanding tones like no idling. It can feel invasive, and we could be rejected just based on a rejection of authority. Next, we have rational appeals, and these explain the benefits of a situation, and occasionally they also give you a desired behavior. So information appeals can play up the arguments in favor of taking an action, like it saves you money, it improves your health, it's better price, quality, it's more convenient. It would make some sort of appeal like that. And they work well for people who are analytical, who want to have a cost-benefit analysis, and that's when these are going to be a good thing to choose. And we have a couple examples here where we have 3 office workers with their heads as dollar bills saying start carpooling and you'll see your coworkers in a whole new way as money savings. And We have also here idling gobbles up fuel, which is making an appeal for people's desire to save money. These tend to work best, again, with analytical people, people who are trying to do some sort of analysis about what they're going to get out of adopting a behavior you're proposing. On the other side, we have emotional appeals, which attempt to trigger an emotional state of arousal or some kind of relationship between people and the actual action that you're proposing. It can be affection, anger, pride, sadness. For target audiences, emotions take less cognitive effort than rational arguments, and they can also promote kind of likable, memorable sorts of relationships with what you're proposing. The risk, however, is that people can feel alienated or insulted sometimes, triggering negative feelings, and you have to be really careful not to make people feel manipulated or exploited by your ads. In our sample, we saw some appealing to loved ones, pets, children, health, patriotism, and happiness were among our emotional appeals. And then we have a few special types of emotional appeals, one of which is the bandwagon. This is appealing to people's desire to belong, to be included somewhere. No one wants to be left out. So what we're proposing here is that you can meet the Idle Free crew in this designated parking lot. This was a sandwich board sign, I believe. Or we also see something more like a religious message, like I support clean air for all God's children, and it's appealing to people's desire to have like the morally high ground. Another special emotional type appeal would be fear. Fear is a special type that promotes negative consequences of failing to take action, typically. Images of people wearing gas masks were extremely common in this section of our survey. A family here is walking together on a hazy day. It's asking, is this family friendly? But the objective overall is to bring about immediate change. And research actually shows that they can be effective. When a realistic solution is given, people want to feel like they're in control of a situation. So if you can give them, okay, this is maybe a scary consequence, but here's a realistic thing to do, then people will take this fight tact where they want to go do something and fix the problem. The problem with air pollution is that there are so many causes of air pollution. A lot of the ads we found don't give any solution, so people don't necessarily know what to do with that information. And beyond that, occasionally, even when there is a specific action like be idle free, it seems small in comparison to the dire future that is predicted by the ad. It feels like useless to do anything at all. And that is the risk with fear appeals, is if in a moderate zone where people feel like they can take action, they can be effective. If it goes too far, then people dismiss it as an exaggeration or they're in denial of it being a problem at all. And the last type, also an emotional appeal, is humor. Because fear can be so overwhelming, we thought humor might be a potential alternative strategy. It can distract audiences from counter-arguing, which can come up in things like rational appeals, where you're trying to give people a cost-benefit analysis. If people are laughing with you, they're not arguing with you. And we found several different types of humor appeals. Parody is first among these, using words or images that have multiple meanings or sounds. Sorry, I'm skipping ahead. So we're on parody and we're mocking something through imitation or exaggeration. And here, this is a Utah license plate where life is polluted instead of elevated, and we cough, choke, gag, and wheeze. Then we have puns and plays on words using multiple meanings or similar sounding words to make a joke. We have here Han Solo, who is carpooling with pretty much the most awesome carpool moods ever. And that's a way to try to get people to adopt a behavior too. Also, we have juvenile appeals, arguing that my mom idles less than your mom, for example, or don't be lonely, drive with a homie. Satire, ridiculing the foolishness of humanity. would be another appeal. We also saw absurd and surreal advertisements, like here, where we're seeing a baby gas mask with a bottle on it. And then lastly, we saw some that were sarcastic, which is saying exactly the opposite of the literal meaning of words, like, I love air pollution, or delicious air you could chew. There are some risks with using humor. They attract attention, they encourage positive feelings, they disarm audience, distract them from counter-arguing, and all of those are good things. The US Department of Transportation, before they introduced the crash dummies, actually had done a series of fear-based ads showing gruesome deaths that had happened without safety belts. That wasn't effective. What did work is bringing out humorous crash dummies who were yelling things like, "My life's a wreck," and children convincing the parents that safety belts were a good idea. So we have a lot of a potential here. What we have to be careful about is that research shows they're not necessarily any more persuasive than a straight ad. Humor can also misfire if people don't understand your joke. For example, if people don't know what the parody is, if they've never seen Star Wars, for example. Or perhaps if they think your sarcasm is literal, then it might not make any sense at all to say clean air smells funny. Humor also has often a shorter shelf life, so to speak. People don't necessarily like seeing the same joke over and over again. So you have to be careful with being tiresome. Okay, here's what we've learned so far. Call to action. It is good at giving people a practical behavior to address air quality. Informational campaigns work best with analytical personalities and combined with creative content. It's important to avoid overloading people with information. People aren't going to read paragraphs. Emotional appeals foster a relationship between the audience and the behavior that you're proposing, and it works best with positive emotions rather than shame or guilt. Bandwagon appeals to people's desire to belong and promote a positive behavior as trust or praiseworthy. Fear appeals promote negative consequences if the audience fails to take action, but don't overdo it. Moderate fear provokes action too much, sends people into denial. Humor uses laughter to evoke positive feelings with the audience. If you relate the humor to your message, it makes it more memorable. And be cautious, because you don't want to offend, confuse, or bore people. So our identification of clean air sponsors and appeals uncovered a few options for our clean air outreach in the future. And our choices will honestly be dependent on our understanding of our target audience, which is the last section here. As we've discussed, people interpret messages through their views, attitudes, and interests. And we have to know what those are. So being up in Cache Valley in Utah, the Census Bureau statistics tell us that 90% of the population is white, and 3/4 are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which influences the local culture, a strong adherence to beliefs and moral character, family, children, health and fitness, education, charity, volunteerism, and preparedness are all important values in the area we live. Until recently, the LDS Church did not have an official opinion on environmental issues. In 2013, there was a website launched that had scriptures and other information about environmental stewardship. And there are also some grassroots movements in the LDS community, including Mormon Environmental Stewardship Alliance. However, in the larger population, I think a lot of this information has yet to be embraced. We also know about our northern Utah audience that Utah's politicians and citizens traditionally favor business and development as opposed to maybe environmental concerns or maybe some opposition to government-imposed restrictions. So we have to keep that in mind. Understanding our community is conservative helps us direct our clean air advocacy. So one question we had is the Salt Lake Chamber of Commerce, they've sponsored clean air messages in the past. Could that be a credible source? Some anecdotal evidence indicates that air pollution may discourage businesses, prospective employees, and maybe their families from wanting to relocate to Utah. So maybe that's a leverage point. Physicians and medical institutions, according to literature, are considered credible for advocating health information. So potentially we found this ad by Intermountain Healthcare. Would ads like this maybe be compelling to people? As Utahns, we love the outdoors as a whole. Sports like winter skiing are popular, snowmobiling, hiking, mountain biking. A lot of you are from Utah. I don't need to tell you what people do here. Tourism brings people in for ski resorts. Two of our largest trade shows annually are the outdoor retailers, and it generates millions for our economy. So could combining outdoor retailers with our passion for the outdoors, our family values, make successful ads like this one with the little girl saying, "I want to play outside," because clean air can affect children's ability to go outside and play at recess. Or maybe we can get more ads like this one with ski resorts looking at carpooling for clean air. Those sorts of things fit into our Utah values. So Mormon scholar Jason Brown blames the deep polarization of environmental issues on the American political landscape. People advocating for environmental issues are often stereotyped with free love, drug culture, secularism. All of these things undermine the values that we see in our communities. So it's potential that, like, while past research indicates that government and nonprofit organizations are especially credible among people, that conservative Utahns may view advocacy organizations as a dissociative group, a group that they don't necessarily want messages from and they don't necessarily want to belong to. Given that that could be true, maybe government and advocacy groups could work on partnering with for-profits, which is a little backwards from what some of the research shows. Or maybe in some cases they conceal their identities, and maybe we're already seeing that. So that's a potential place to move forward. There's room for businesses to be clean air advocates. So overall, our typology of PSA, message sponsors and appeals, we reviewed past literature to look at a good way to get consistently better clean air messaging. Our next step is to test some of our ideas based on all of the good information and the ads and things that are out there and see what really is working, because we're all trying to do it, but it's hard to tell what's been effective. And to create a common recommendation for drafting PSAs in the future and communicating with relevant groups when we have results. If any of you have additions or information that you have out of your own personal experiences, I would love to hear it. I'm sharing this today as a roadmap for anybody out there who's trying to design PSA messages for pro-social behavior and developing more compelling PSAs and social messaging in the future. So with that, I'm done with giving you information. I'm going to open it up to questions and discussion.